Okay, today we will continue our series in the Minor Prophets by covering the book of Jonah. This book is unlike any of the other prophetic books in that it lacks specific prophecies for the time of the end. It is almost entirely the story about an incident between God and one of his prophets. The name of this prophet, Jonah, means dove. He was the son of Amittai, which means literally my truth. Extrapolated, then, the name My Truth means literally the truth of God. His home, Jonah's home, was Gath-Hepher, a town in Zebulun in the district of Galilee. Jonah's service as a prophet is documented during the reign of Jeroboam II back in 2 Kings chapter 14. Let's look back here very quickly at this. Remember, Jeroboam II was not the original Jeroboam, obviously. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who took Israel, the northern kingdom, into idolatry. But this is a later king, Jeroboam II, king of the northern kingdom of Israel, basically from the year 793 to 753 BC. Here in verse 25 of 2 Kings 14, we read, Jeroboam II, restored the territory of Israel from the entrance of Hamath to the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord God of Israel, which he had spoken through, note, his servant, God's servant, Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath-Hepher. Based on events recorded in Assyrian history, the actual event depicted in this book occurred shortly after the death of the Assyrian king Adad-Nirari III, who died in 782 BC. 782 BC. It was during this period, after the death of Adad-Nirari, that Assyria was attempting to defend its northern border from incursions of the Urartu kingdom. Urartu, simply a derivation of the word Ararat. It was the area of Ararat where there was a kingdom of mountainous people that the Assyrians had attacked for literally centuries, would go up into that area and attack them. And things had turned, the tables had turned, and now the Urartu kingdom had strengthened and the Assyrian kingdom was beginning to wane. Now, there are several purposes for the preservation of this very unusual prophetic book. The one best known is how the length of time Jonah spent in the belly of the great fish was a type of the length of time Jesus spent in the tomb, from the burial of his body until he left the tomb at the end of the Sabbath, 3 days and 3 nights later. Let's note here in Matthew chapter 12, verse 38, this point that Jesus brings out. Matthew 12, verse 38, "Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, 'Teacher, we want to see a sign from you.' But he answered and said to them, 'An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah.'" So Jesus makes reference to Jonah, and then he goes on to explain, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." And so God obviously preserved this book for one of the main reasons for the preservation of this book was for this particular reason, to substantiate a sign regarding what the Messiah must do. He must be dead for 3 days, 3 nights, and buried. That was the sign, the only sign Jesus gave to that generation. And so God made certain that it was preserved, but there are other reasons. And the other reasons for this book will be evident as we cover its contents this morning. All right, back here to the notes again. God inspired the placement of this book immediately after the book of Obadiah that we covered in the last sermon in this series. And God did so, placed it here for a very important reason. Because Obadiah depicts the annihilation of the adult males and the utter destruction of a national or tribal identity of a non-Israelite people, some people reading the book could draw the mistaken conclusion that God reserves compassion and mercy only for Israel and the descendants of Israel, that he doesn't care about anyone else. The story of Jonah, however, sets the record straight. God can and God does show compassion and extends mercy to those who obey Him, do what He instructs, regardless of their descent. Even Obadiah is telling us about the descent of one of the families from Abraham, because Esau was related to Abraham. And the Jews were always talking about, well, it's not our father Abraham, our father Abraham. Well, Esau could say the same thing. And yet God is going to annihilate any national identity, tribal identity of Esau in the world to come. Now, some have attempted to interpret the book of Jonah strictly allegorically and understand Jonah to be a type of the nation of Israel. And there are some good reasons for thinking that, and I'll give you just a few of the connections. First of all, Jonah was chosen by God to be a witness to another nation by speaking directly to them. He went to them to tell them that they needed to do certain things. Israel was chosen by God to be a witness, just like Jonah was chosen to be a witness. But Israel was to be a witness to all nations by living God's way and thereby being a model or an example to other peoples of what they needed to change. A second parallel would be that Jonah initially refused to do what God instructed him to do and hightailed it off in a completely different direction. Israel did virtually the same thing, because Israel initially refused to obey God. They chose, rather, to go in a different direction than God told them to go by copying the example of the nations around them rather than being an example to those nations. So they did just the opposite, same thing that Jonah did. Another parallel is that Jonah was removed from and carried away from the life that he had lived when he was swallowed by a great fish. Israel was removed from life, the life it knew, in the land of promise, and carried away into exile. Another parallel is that Jonah humbled himself while cut off from the world he knew. He was no longer terrestrial, he was aquatic. So he was cut off from the world he knew. Israel will be humbled, just like Jonah was humbled while he was cut off from his world. Israel will be humbled while being cut off from the land of Israel, just as God prophesied back in Deuteronomy. Another parallel is that Jonah returned to his land after being humbled. He returned to a terrestrial environment after he was humbled. The remnant of all of Israel's tribes will be returned to the land of Israel after being humbled through the tribulation of the events that occur during the day of the Lord. And so we find, and again there are others, but that should suffice to see that indeed an allegorical interpretation seems on the surface to be quite plausible, but it doesn't hold all the way through the book because there's certain things that begin to break down. So it does, the allegorical interpretation does contain some correct parallels, but the entire book cannot be considered allegorical. All right, with that, again, we'll understand some other reasons as we go on. Let's go then to chapter 1, verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, and again, as noted earlier, Amittai means literally the truth of God. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that the name of the father of Jonah not only portrays Jonah's dedication in delivering God's message, because he took God's message to the people, but it also depicts Jonah's forthrightness. Again, he is the son of the truth of God. That is, Jonah was blunt. He was to the point. He was honest. When called upon to give account, we find that Jonah spoke whatever was on his mind. He didn't couch anything. He didn't hold back. Even with God. He told God exactly what he thought. God, you did this because of thus and such. And so Jonah was truthful. That's one thing we can say about this man. He was very truthful. He was right up front with what he believed. Verse 2, the Tanakh translates, "Go at once," God said, "to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim judgment upon it, for their wickedness has come before me." Moffat has, "and thunder in their ears that their wickedness is known to me." Now he talks about Nineveh, that great city. Well, Nineveh was situated on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, directly across the river from what today is the modern-day city of Mosul, Iraq. I think most of us kind of know where that is. If we paid any attention to the Iraqi war. Okay, so it was on the east side of the Tigris. Mosul is on the west side of the Tigris. That was where it was located. According to classical writers, it was the largest city in the known world of that day. That is, we have to leave out China, the Far East. And so for what was known, let's say the Western world, this was the largest city of the day. It was larger even than Babylon. And Babylon, of course, was a very great city. At the time of the events recorded in this book, the city and the smaller towns, let's say the suburbs around the walled city itself, had a population of at least 600,000, possibly as many as 1 million people. So this is a fairly significant sized metropolitan area. And again, verse 2, God said, "For their wickedness has come before me." We need to understand, God required Jonah to inform the Assyrians of Nineveh that their conduct had degenerated so much that God could not allow them to continue on as a people. He could not allow them to continue to exist because of what had happened to them. Their wickedness was comparable to that of the pre-flood world, as the days of Noah. Back in Genesis chapter 6 and verses 5 and 13, God made it very clear to Noah that, he records that the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in all of the earth. So he saw it. Here it says that their wickedness has come before me. I'm privy of their wickedness. God said the same thing about the days of Noah. Their violence, their wickedness has come before me. And it is also very similar to their wickedness has come before me to Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 18. And beginning in verse 20, where God came down, manifested himself, that is, the Word manifested himself to Abraham, and told Abraham that he was there because of the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah had come to him. And he was coming down to see if things were as bad as what he was told. Of course, he already knew. This was a relation to Abraham in order to relate certain things to him and to get a response out of Abraham. And so we find that Nineveh was to the point of as the days of Noah and as the days of Lot. So in one sense, kind of an end-time parallel, but not a real tight parallel. Verse 3, Tanakh goes on, "Jonah, however, started out to flee to Tarshish from the Lord's service. He went down to Joppa, found a ship going to Tarshish. He paid the fare and went aboard to sail with the others to Tarshish away from the service of the Lord." Now, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, Tarshish was actually the city or the mining town of Tartessus in southern Spain. So Jonah, we find here, was attempting to cross the entire Mediterranean Sea, heading in the opposite direction of Nineveh, because Nineveh would have been to the east and to the north. And here he's going all the way to southern Spain, or what he was attempting to do. Jonah's reaction to God's direction was entirely opposite that of Amos. We just covered Amos sometime back in our Minor Prophet series. Amos, remember, said that he was simply caring for the sheep, taking care, tending the sycamore fig trees. He was doing things that he would normally be doing as just, an agrarian, and God called him. And God said, "Okay, Amos, I'm going to send you to prophesy to Israel," at which time Amos did exactly what God said. He went directly to Israel, did what he was told. Jonah, I'm going to send you to Assyria. Jonah says, "What you think, I'm taking off. I'm a dove. I've got wings, and I'm taking flight." And that's what he did. Jonah knew. And why did Jonah do this? Well, Jonah knew that the Assyrians were a warmongering people, and that they used inhumane violence against the people they conquered. Based on Israel's past encounters with Assyria, he knew that the Assyrians were the type of people, he may have even known the prophecies, we later on see that God gave to Isaiah to make, regarding the rise of Assyria. In fact, he probably knew what Hosea had already prophesied, and that Assyria was going to be a major problem in the future for Israel, that God would use Assyria in order to punish the northern kingdom for its sins. And so Jonah desired to see the Assyrians destroyed. And God has just told him, you better go and tell them, otherwise I'm going to have to destroy them. And Jonah didn't want them to be saved. He wanted them to be destroyed. Again, as he later reveals in chapter 4, Jonah knew that God would be merciful and remove the judgment announced against the Assyrians, because he knew how compassionate God was, and he knew when the Assyrians heard the message, God would make sure that they made the change. And so Jonah wanted no part in warning the Assyrians of God's displeasure with that particular people. Verse 4, the New International translates, "Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea. Such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up." Now, this was no ordinary storm. It was much more severe than any of these sailors, and I would say probably seasoned sailors, had previously experienced, and it arose suddenly. It was totally unusual, something that they had never experienced. By this action, by the immediate onset of this storm, God reveals that no one can escape from doing His service. If He's decided that someone is going to take care of and do something for Him, no one can escape it. In verse 5, the New International goes on, "All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship." Now, most of the sailors were probably Phoenicians based upon sailing from Joppa, and they were, again, the most hardy seafaring peoples in the Mediterranean of that day. And so they were probably Phoenicians, which means they were from different areas. Not all the Phoenicians were necessarily of the same descent, but they did worship different idols. They were polytheistic, like virtually every people in the world of that day. But Jonah, goes on to say in verse 5, had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. Now, if Jonah had traveled all the way from Gath-hepher to Joppa as quickly as possible in order to escape from doing what God wanted him to do, he was worn out from making his escape, which explains how he could sleep through the turbulence that was being encountered by this ship, because it was going up and down and all over, and everybody was scared to death, and Jonah just down there sawing logs. Verse 6, New International goes on, "The captain went to him and said, 'How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe He will take notice of us, and we will not perish.' Since the pagan sailors were not certain which one of their many gods they believed to exist was upset with them and responsible for their current plight, the captain ordered Jonah to get up and appeal to the God that he worshiped. Because who knows which one of the many gods there are that's doing this to us." Verse 7, going on in the New International, "Then the sailors said to each other, 'Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity.' They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah." Serious storms occurred only during the winter season in the Mediterranean. No ship captain would attempt to sail to the western Mediterranean all the way from Joppa at that time of year. And as the story unfolds, we find out that this is actually summertime, okay, because of what happens to Jonah in Nineveh. And so we are in summertime. This is not the wintertime. Therefore, and again, we know from Acts chapter 27, verses 9 through 12, that during that time of year that ships would go into harbor and wait out the stormy season before they went back out. I mean, wherever they were, they'd pull into a harbor, and they would stay there till the winter bad weather was over, so that they were able to ply the seas without breaking up. Therefore, the storm that they were experiencing during this time of the year caused the sailors to deduce that someone on board the ship was responsible for their dilemma, and they intended to find out whoever that guilty party was. God made certain then that the method of discovery, casting lots, pointed to Jonah. God made absolutely certain that whatever turned up, that's exactly who it was. There was no chance at all in this. Jonah was going to be guilty. Verse 8, the Tanakh translates, "They said to him, 'Tell us, you who have brought this misfortune upon us, what is your business? Where have you come from? What is your country? Of what people are you?'" Notice the line of questioning. Their questions were an attempt to understand if and how Jonah had displeased his God. They wanted to know if the storm was truly the result of the justified anger of Jonah's God, or if the storm had been sent by one of their gods who was simply bored and desired entertainment by watching them struggle during this storm. And that's the way they believed about their gods. Remember, the Greek gods, the Roman gods, they would intervene. You read Iliad, the Odyssey, and Homer's books and all of this other, and you find out, boy, they would do tricks on people just for entertainment. That was the kind of gods that they worshiped. And so they were thinking, well, maybe it is, and maybe they tricked us, and maybe the lot fell on him because they want to divert attention from what they're doing because they like to see us struggle down here. That could be it. They're just trying to figure it out. Verse 9, Tanakh goes on. I am a Hebrew, he replied. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made both sea and land. Jonah informed them that he was a servant of the God who made the sea, which at that very moment was about to destroy their ship. All right, so Jonah's God was a God that created the sea. Now, they may have been worshiping Neptune, or Poseidon, who is the Greek equivalent of the Roman Neptune. That may be what they, But Jonah's God made the sea. Neptune may, Poseidon may have jurisdiction, but Jonah's God actually made it. So he's more powerful than their gods. Verse 10, the New Living Translation better states, then he told them that he was running away from the Lord. The sailors were terrified when they heard this. Oh, why did you do it? They groaned. You see, they were horrified that he would knowingly disobey such a powerful God. How can you go away from a God that's this powerful? Verse 11, again in the New International. The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? Rather than doing anything to Jonah that might further upset his God, and since only Jonah knew what would appease his God, the sailors appealed to Jonah to offer a solution that would save their lives. Jonah, whatever. Your God is so powerful. What would it take to appease him? What can we do? Verse 12, Tanakh goes on. He, Jonah, answered, heave me overboard, and the sea will calm down for you. I know that this terrible storm came upon you on my account. Notice that Jonah was willing to be sacrificed in order to save those who were about to die. Look, you can have my life. Throw me overboard. That's what it's going to take. You're going to have to throw me overboard. You're going to have to sacrifice me if you want to be saved. Verse 13, we kind of see a little bit of a parallel here, don't we, to certain things in the New Testament. Verse 13, New International, instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Of course, they could not use their sails. They had to drop their sails because of the wind. And so now they were trying to row into shore. Rather than immediately throwing this Hebrew foreigner overboard, the pagan sailors did their very best to try and save the life of this man. In so doing, they showed far more concern for his solitary life than Jonah later on showed for the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in the Assyrian Empire. The harder these sailors worked to try to save Jonah and themselves, the more vicious the storm became. So they were not making any headway as they rowed toward the shore. Verse 14, Tanakh. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Oh, please, Lord, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not hold us guilty of killing an innocent person, for you, O Lord, by your will have brought this about." Before hurling Jonah into the raging sea to what they knew would be certain death, no ifs, ands, or buts, it was going to be a certain death, the sailors all appealed to the God of Jonah not to hold them responsible for what they understood to be the fulfillment of the will of Jonah's God. Verse 15, New International. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. Tanakh states, stopped raging. The Hebrew word that is here literally means the sea stood. The sea stood. In other words, the water immediately ceased its turbulence. Such a dramatic event astonished these sailors. They'd never seen anything like it. How a storm could just, everything is just churning and it's, boom, it just stops. That's uncanny. This has never happened. And so they were terrified. Verse 16, Tanakh goes on, the men feared the Lord greatly. When they saw these things, they feared the Lord greatly. They offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. The response of these sailors indicated that they believed Jonah's God had power over the sea and over the wind. But their reaction did not indicate that they planned to cease worshiping their supposed gods and idols, because they believed in a myriad of gods. And this is a very powerful God, but they did not, you read some of the commentaries, and this was the beginning of God beginning to bring the Gentiles to repentance and blah, 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 blah. No, not according to what the Scripture says. In other places it's not. That's not the case at all. These men simply feared this God of Jonah, but it didn't mean they didn't still believe there are others. So this is nothing about the conversion of the Gentiles. All right, verse 17. New King James has, now the Lord had prepared. Other translations have provided or appointed. The Hebrew word can be translated all of those ways. God had prepared or provided or appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. This fish was as much a miracle as the starting and stopping of this raging storm. God guided events so that this special fish was in readiness once Jonah was thrown into the sea. Now, it's possible this fish was created just for this purpose. In fact, you will find rabbinic tradition that, I think from the Targums, that God created this great fish at the creation of all fish. From the very beginning, this fish has been around for thousands of years, waiting for this one moment. I don't accept that idea, okay? Maybe it was, but I don't think so. But it is very possible that it was created just for this purpose. That's what it seems to say. God had prepared, you see, or appointed just for this very purpose. But it's also possible that this was a species of fish that God caused to mutate and grow to an abnormally large size so that it could swallow a man. That seems very plausible. God either miraculously supplied fresh air within the fish, within Jonah's lungs, or God provided the fish with a huge cavity inside, which was free of liquid, large enough that Jonah had air to breathe while it was in the fish's belly. Again, when God prepared this fish, exactly how did He prepare it? Was it made differently than all other fish on the inside? Then Jonah also had to be protected. God had to protect him from being digested. He's 3 days, 3 nights in the fish's belly, and all of these digestive juices are being released. These enzymes are there to digest whatever the fish swallows. And so God had to either suppress the production of those digestive enzymes, or He had to encase Jonah in some kind of a protective coating so that he would still be there 3 days and 3 nights later. Okay, so God prepared this fish. This fish was quite different. But it says that Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Being closed within the darkness of the fish, under the surface of the water, was a type of being buried in a tomb. It was a type of that. This was the analogy that Jesus used when He connected the amount of time that Jonah was inside the fish to the length of time that his body would be in the tomb. 3 days and 3 nights, according to what we read earlier in Matthew 12, verse 40. Verse 1 of chapter 2. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly. Now, Jonah had plenty of time, 3 days and 3 nights, to consider the choices that he had made, which had brought him to his present circumstances, languishing inside this fish. He no doubt spent many hours meditating and praying, yet the only prayer that is preserved is the one that he uttered in thanksgiving at the close of the 72 hours, which now we read about in the next several verses for the remainder of this chapter. The New International has, verse 2, he said, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave, or out of the belly of Sheol," the New King James has, "I called for help, and you listened to my cry." Notice he says, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me." This verse summarizes Jonah's contact with God throughout the unfolding of the events over the 3 days and 3 nights period, beginning with his being thrown into the raging sea. The prayer that he goes through catalogs all that God had done for Jonah and would yet perform for Jonah. Jonah considered his deliverance from death already accomplished, while he remained inside the fish, because he says, "I called to the Lord, and he answered me." He already had his answer. He knew what was going to happen. He knew he was going to be saved. He knew he was going to be delivered. He already knew that while he was still in the fish. This mindset reveals the level of faith that Jonah possessed. It was the faith of God that had been given to him. That faith of God is defined for us back here in Romans chapter 4 and verse 17. Romans 4:17, the latter part of the verse, "God, who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did." Jonah was still in the fish. He had not yet been delivered, but he was calling deliverance, that he would be delivered. He was absolutely certain of it, even though it hadn't occurred. So Jonah had faith. Jonah's prayer of thanksgiving that we read here in these several verses is full of allusions to various phrases from the Psalms, showing that he was very knowledgeable of the Holy Scriptures that were then extant. He knew, he studied, he was very familiar with what at that time was the Word of God. Verse 3, the New International continues, "You hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me." Jonah saw God's hand in everything that had transpired. As he's praying, he says, I can see your hand in all of it. God caused the storm to rise up. God guided the casting of lots so that Jonah was chosen. God prevented the sailors from rescuing Jonah by rowing back to the shore. God provided the fish that swallowed him to save him from drowning in the swift currents and the breaking waves. He saw God's hand in all of that. He says, "You hurled me, your waves." So all of this is attributed to what God had done. Verse 4, the New King James goes on, "Then I said, I have been cast out of your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple." Now, from the moment he went under the water, he was confident that should he die, this is early on, should he die, God would grant him life again. He understood the resurrection. That's what this says. "I've been cast out of your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple." Verse 5, the New International, "The engulfing waters threatened me," or closed in over me, the Tanakh says. "The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head." The longer he was in the water, the more dire the circumstances to Jonah became. Currents were pulling him down, entangling him in seaweed. He was only seconds from death when the fish came from seemingly out of nowhere and swallowed him. Verse 6, the New King James has, "I went down to the moorings of the mountains. The earth with its bars closed behind me forever. Yet you have brought up my life from the pit. O Lord my God. Within the belly of the fish, Jonah went to depths so great that human rescue would have been absolutely impossible. He was so far removed from the atmosphere that he felt himself locked in the prison of the realm of death with no hope of escape. The bars were there. He couldn't get past the bars. However, in the face of certain death and the destruction of his body, Jonah was saved from the grave of the sea. Verse 7, New International. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you. The New King James says, I remembered thee, Lord. I remember you, Lord. I remembered thee, Lord. And my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. As he was about to lose consciousness in the moments before drowning in the sea, he called out to God in heaven, and he pleaded with God for his deliverance and for forgiveness. Verse 8, Revised English Bible has, those who cling to false gods may abandon their loyalty. Or the New American Standard has, those who cling to false gods may forsake their faithfulness. Now, the emphasis of the Revised English Bible and the New American Standard translations of this verse is that those who pledge loyalty to the idols that they worship, to the gods that they worship, the false gods, those people, those idolaters can be compelled to desert those idols and those false gods when they feel that those false gods have deserted them. Well, if you're not going to help me, I'm going to turn somewhere else. Because remember, they had a pantheon. They had many. They were polytheistic. They had all kinds of gods, and so they could look to a different one. So they wouldn't remain faithful to that particular god. Moffat has, for verse 8, those who heed vain idols leave their real refuge. You see, the emphasis in the Moffat translation is that all who look to idols for help have deserted the only one who is actually in existence and has the power to come to their aid, that being, of course, the true God. So there's a little variation in the way the Hebrew is rendered in the various translations in verse 8. Now, verse 9, but I will sacrifice to you, the New King James has, with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation, deliverance, the Tanakh has, is of the Lord. So unlike the worshipers of false gods, Jonah continued to cling to God without hesitation. Jonah says, look, God, I'm not turning anywhere else. You're it. I know you are the one, the only. So I'm not going to be disloyal like the pagans are with their gods. No, I'm going to hang on to you tenaciously, never looking anywhere else for help. That was Jonah. Jonah knew he deserved absolutely no mercy for attempting to run away from the responsibility that God had given him to perform. But because he worshiped the true God, and he knew how merciful God is, Jonah knew that he could receive God's mercy if he admitted and repented of his error. He knew that that's what was required. During the time of his confinement, he apparently vowed to carry out what God had commissioned him to do, because he says here, I will pay what I have vowed. And so sometime during that 3 days, 3 nights, he said, okay, get me out of here. I will do whatever. I'll go to China. Wherever you want me to go, I'll do it. But just get me out of here. Verse 10, so the Lord spoke to the fish. Tanakh says the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. The actual location where Jonah was discharged is unknown. Josephus says that he was vomited out on the seas of the Black Sea. Now, if you look at a map, that fish has to be, a Trident-class submarine moving at an incredible rate to go all the way up and around to the Black Sea. 3 days? I don't think so. Okay, so I think Josephus is in error there. There are things that he has, and there are other times that he kind of made things up. I mean, you just have to read Josephus suspiciously sometimes. So we really don't know where. However, since the territory of the Assyrian Empire extended all the way west to the coastal region of the northeastern Mediterranean, it is a reasonable assumption that he was liberated from his water transport somewhere in that area, that the fish came up and spit him out into what then was the Assyrian Empire. It's also possible that there were witnesses to this event. Since the people of Mesopotamia worshipped the fish god Oannes, who is called Dagon by the Philistines, half man, half fish, Oannes, which it's interesting. Oannes, the name Oannes, is almost identical to Jonah. It's just a one-letter difference in the way Jonah would be spelled and the fish god Oannes. But since many of the people did worship that fish god, if any of those particular Assyrians were witnesses to this event, they would have concluded that Jonah was sent by Oannes. And let me tell you, word would have reached Nineveh long before Jonah got there. It's amazing how quick gossip, can hit the airwaves. It's like there's nothing between the person and 100 miles or 1,000 miles away. And this was before the internet. And yet they could still, the word would just fly. Chapter 3, verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you. Now we're not told whether Jonah was allotted any time for recuperation after being, kind of in tight quarters for 3 days and 3 nights. Or if this command that was given was issued immediately after he was released. We're not told. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time. Now, if Jonah was spit out of the fish in Assyrian territory up in the northeastern part of the Mediterranean coastline, he would have been 3 days closer to Nineveh than had he left Israel. In other words, basically God used the fish to get him 3 days on up the road, and he's already up, to the highway going east to Nineveh. So he wasn't really behind schedule. He was right there. Verse 3, so Jonah arose and he went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, a 3-day journey in extent, or as the New American Standard has, a 3 days walk. Jonah responded to God's command without hesitation this time. In accordance with the vow that he made while he was still inside the great fish, he took off. He went to do what he was told to do. According to the historian Diodorus Siculus, who used records and accounts that had been preserved from the time of Jonah, Nineveh was described as a city that was 60 miles in circumference. The walls were 100 feet tall, and they were wide enough that 3 chariots could be driven side by side around the perimeter of the city on top of this wall. So Nineveh was indeed a great city, as it says. The city was large enough that it would take 3 days to walk completely around it. The emphasis of a 3-day journey in extent, as it's here in the New King James, is on the size of the city, not on the amount of time that Jonah would need to deliver God's message. God didn't say, okay, Jonah, you got 3 days to deliver the message. That was not what he had. A city that size would be much too large to cover thoroughly in a period of 3 days. Unless people knew that some, real important person was coming, if word had gotten there, and then people would be thronged to come and hear. Like some, maybe some politician or rock star or movie star or whatever. They all want to flock down and see this particular individual. And maybe that was the case with Jonah. But it was going to take some time for him to move through the city. It was a huge city. 3 days is simply describing how large the city was. Verse 4, And Jonah began to enter the city on the first day's walk. Then he cried out and said, Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Notice, the first day's walk. Now, it's not saying the first day's walk because he's only got 2 more days to do this. It's connecting the first day's walk to the message. Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. He didn't say that on the second day. He said 39 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. And on the third day, 38 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. The fourth day, 37 days and Nineveh will... You see, he was counting down. He was counting down. And so many times it's been connected, well, he just had 3 days to give the... No, that's not necessarily true. That's what, has been assumed, but that's not what the Scripture says. The primary message that Jonah delivered was the total destruction of Nineveh was already determined, and the time of its demise was already appointed. There was no room for any fluctuation. This was a done deal. That's the way the message came across. There may have been, and no doubt was, more to the message than what we have here. That is, the message that Jonah actually preached. He may have said considerably more than this synopsis. In fact, if what Josephus writes is accurate, then there was more to the message. He records here in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 9, Chapter 10, Paragraph 2. He states that Jonah went to the city of Nineveh, where he stood so as to be heard, and preached that in a very little time they, Assyria, they should lose the dominion of Asia. So you see, that's more than what we hear or know of here in Jonah's account. It's preserved in the Bible. So, verse 5, the people of Nineveh believed God. Now, Nineveh, again, one of the great cities of the Assyrian Empire. Eventually, Nineveh became the capital of the Assyrian Empire. It wasn't the capital at this time, but it did become that. So it was one of the great cities of the Assyrian Empire. They believed God, proclaimed a fast, put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them, or as Moffat says, from the highest to the lowest, from the highest class to the lowest class of citizenry. The Scripture does not imply, as some of the commentaries will tell you, that they turned to God and became God-fearing people. That's not what this says. It only says that they believed what the prophet that God had sent declared that his God had said, and they were willing to do whatever they could to abate the anger of Jonah's God. That's what this says. It says no more than that. It does not say that there was a giant revival and they were coming down to the altar. Okay? That is not. Despite what you read in commentaries, this is not what it's saying. The people of Nineveh listened to and acted on the message of God which was brought to them by Jonah. It was their manner of responding that Jesus later lauded to the Jews who refused to respond to the message that he brought. Back in Matthew chapter 12, verse 41. Matthew 12, verse 41. The men of Nineveh, Jesus was telling them. Again, remember, he was speaking to the scribes, the Pharisees. He was speaking to those who thought very highly of themselves and were treating him in a way that was not respectful whatsoever. The men of Nineveh, Jesus told them, will rise in the judgment with this generation. That is, in the judgment of the last day. The white throne judgment. Will rise in the judgment with this generation and condemn it. Why? Because they, the men of Nineveh, repented at the preaching of Jonah. They took action on what they heard a man who represented God had said. And indeed, a greater than Jonah is here with you, scribes and Pharisees, Jesus is saying. Jesus brought a message as well, but they didn't heed his message from God. The Ninevites heeded what Jonah said. That was the comparison. Now, one reason that the Ninevites were very quick to heed the message delivered by Jonah was the impending threat of the army of the Urartu kingdom, which was coming from the north. That's where it was, Nineveh lay almost directly south of Mount Ararat. And so those people were pushing down. The army had advanced southward to less than 100 miles from Nineveh. That's how close it was. That's how close it was. Less than 100 miles. And when the Ninevites considered the distance, because they had forces up there to try and prevent the Urartu kingdom from pushing any further down, the armies of the Urartu kingdom, they knew without a question that the city could easily be reached in 40 days from a distance of 100 miles. And so they were willing to repent. And also, as we mentioned earlier, if there were witnesses to Jonah's expulsion from the great fish, Jonah's credibility would be very high among these pagan polytheistic Assyrians. There was a fish that spit him out, that he was obviously a prophet from the God. We're never, it was the true God that sent the message, the true God that sent Jonah. But how did the Assyrians react to this? Because God never asked Jonah to preach to them, the Ten Commandments. He told them something else. He preached something else. In verse 6, then word came to the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne and laid aside his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he caused it to be proclaimed and published throughout Nineveh by the decree of the king and of his nobles, saying, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink water. It is here in this verse, or these two verses, that the king declared that all people and animals fast. And yet the people were already fasting in verse 5, because it says the people of Nineveh believed God, proclaimed to fast, put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least. All right, from the king on down. So we've already read that they did it, and yet now we're finding the king makes the decree after everybody's doing it. Well, there's no oversight, there's no contradiction, there's no real problem with this verse or these verses. Many times in Hebrew narrations, the effect or the outcome of an event is mentioned first, and then the cause for that event or the cause for that outcome is mentioned later. All through the Kings, you read where, and Israel was taken by the Assyrians, removed from their land and taken into captivity. That was the outcome. Because they heeded not God's instruction and they broke His Sabbath and would not tear down the groves. And so the reason for what occurred is mentioned afterward. So this is kind of a typical way the Hebrew unfolds, or the way narrations are done. So there's no contradiction. It's just he's telling you what occurred, what the outcome was, and then what caused the outcome. The reason animals were required to go without food and water was because they were considered to be full members of the community. That was common then. And it's kind of common now. Anytime you have a parade, what do? They dress the horses up. I mean, today people dress their dogs up. They make snugglies for dogs. They make things for cats. And, so people treat their animals like part of the family, and indeed, they are part of the family for some people. Okay? So, if you're part of the family, you got to do this. That's basically what was said. When the city did something, the animals were required to do whatever the humans did. This was to prove to the God of Jonah how serious these people were. Every member of the community would be required to participate because every member of the community stood to lose his, her, or its life if this God of Jonah didn't change his mind. Verse 8, the New American Standard has, but both man and beast, or both man and animals, must be covered with sackcloth, and let men call on God earnestly. The king is continuing, king of Nineveh is continuing to speak here. Let men call on God earnestly or urgently, New International has, that each may turn from his wicked way and from the violence, Tanakh says, injustice, which is in his hands. All of the Assyrians were required to humble themselves and change the way they viewed themselves and others. Due to the extension of their power and dominance over other peoples for literally hundreds of years, for centuries, the Assyrians perceived themselves to be a superior people. They were superior to everyone else, and therefore they treated all non-Assyrians with disdain. They treated a non-Assyrian as subhuman, very similar to the reaction that Hitler was able to foist upon his followers in Germany. You know, that the Poles, that the Gypsies, that the Jews were subhuman. And that's the way the Assyrians treated all peoples that were not Assyrian. You know, Hitler was wanting the Aryan race, you know, the blue eyes, the blondes, and all of this. And everybody else needed to be extinguished. That's kind of this mentality that the Assyrians had. Now, this dictate of the king, and again, it says the king of Nineveh. It doesn't say the king of the Assyrian Empire. And so someone will say, well, you know, which one of the kings of Assyria would have done this? It doesn't say the king of the Assyrian Empire. The king of the city of Nineveh. And Nineveh was not the capital at this time. And so this was someone who was of significant power, but we don't have a name of this particular individual. But again, to be a ruler, they had this mentality of being, you know, above. They were superhuman, and all non-Assyrians were subhuman. So the dictate of this particular king was so out of character for an Assyrian leader that it must have been, what he said here, turn from your wickedness, from the violence in your hands, this must have been included in the message that Jonah delivered. That's another part of what Jonah had said. You know, you have done these things, and therefore 40 days you're going to be wiped out, 39 days, etc., etc. All right, verse 9, the New Revised Standard says, who knows? God may relent and change his mind, or have pity on us, other translation has. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish. These carnal people were sincere. This was no facade. They were very sincere. They knew this was life and death, and they hoped that somehow, some way, they could receive God's mercy. Verse 10, Tanakh has, God saw what they did, how they were turning back from their evil ways, and God renounced the punishment he had planned to bring upon them and did not carry it out. God showed compassion to these Gentiles because they were willing to do what he had asked. Regardless of, whether it was, they still believed in other gods or whatever. That wasn't part of the deal here. The deal was you got to turn from your wicked ways and from the violence that's in your hands. You've got to get rid of this superior mentality that you have. This is what you got to do. And they did that. They did that. They turned back. They turned from their cruel ways. They turned from plundering and brutalizing other peoples because they enjoyed inflicting pain. They enjoyed murder. They got a charge out of it, like these serial killers. They get a charge out of taking someone's life. That was what God said. You got to get rid of this mentality. Chapter 4, verse 1. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. Why was Jonah so upset? Because he realized at this point that his homeland, the northern kingdom, was doomed. They were doomed. Now that the Assyrians had received compassion from God, they weren't going to be wiped out. The Assyrians would continue to be there. They would loom as a threat. And of course, being a prophet, Jonah was well aware of the sins of the northern kingdom. He was aware that God was not pleased, and he knew what God did. Verse 2. So he, Jonah, prayed to the Lord and said, Ah, Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my country? Now, we weren't told this earlier. We weren't told that, God said, Jonah, get up, do this. Jonah took off. But after God told him that, we also find here that Jonah said, you know what? Remember when you told me to do that? I prayed, and I said, Lord, hey, you remember something? Remember something? I said this was going to happen. I said this was going to happen. Therefore, I fled previously to Tarshish. For I know, or at least he attempted to flee to Tarshish, for I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm, or the Tanakh has, renouncing punishment. Jonah was upset with God's decision because it was contrary to what Jonah thought should be done. He was convinced God was wrong. God was absolutely incorrect by showing mercy to these bloodthirsty, cold-hearted Assyrians. See, Jonah knew, look, God, I know what those Assyrians are like. You don't understand them like I do. This is what Jonah is relating to God. You don't understand them like I do. Jonah had been very thankful for the mercy that God had showed him when he was saved from drowning and delivered from certain death, when he repented of his original disobedience. He repented, he changed, and he was delivered. He was saved from drowning, he was saved from death. And yet he felt the Ninevites should be denied the same mercy, even though they too had humbled themselves and repented of the error of their ways. Things aren't equal here. Things aren't fair. God didn't say, well, look, Jonah, this is what I did for you. Was I not fair to you? Now, how am I going to be fair to the Assyrians? I don't want to be unfair. I'm going to be fair to everybody. Up to this point in the story, it's been very clear that Jonah had faith. We saw that earlier. He saw that he was going to be delivered. He knew while he was still in the fish he would see deliverance. So he had faith. He trusted that God always knows best and acts accordingly. That was Jonah up to this point. However, it's now clear that Jonah wanted God to do things the way he, Jonah, thought best. He wanted God to be in his image rather than he try to be in God's. Another point of this book, because we have a problem with that. When things are going the way we think they should go, we're okay with it. But when God says, you know what, we're going to do a little bit differently here, I'm going to throw you a curve, all of a sudden we're not happy with that. We need to learn from what Jonah learned. Verse 3, Tanakh states, Please, Lord, take my life, for I would rather die than live. Jonah was now pouting because things didn't go the way he wanted them to go. So I'm going to pout. Verse 4, Then the Lord said, Is it right for you to be angry? Is it right? Is this reaction the correct reaction for one who has a relationship with me? God is asking Job. God now continues the extension of his mercy in dealing with Jonah. He didn't chastise Jonah for his attitude. He didn't do that. Instead, God patiently worked with Jonah in a merciful manner. He began by asking Jonah to consider whether the position he had taken in respect to how he felt God should act was justifiable. Jonah, are you justified with this position you're taking? See, God could have just, boom, who do you think you are talking to me like this, questioning me? God didn't do that. He continued to exude mercy. This is the same God that a lot of people say, that's the wrathful God of the Old Testament. Well, this doesn't sound like the wrathful God of the Old Testament, the way they portray God. exceedingly merciful. Verse 5, so Jonah went out of the city and sat on the east side of the city. There he made himself a shelter and sat under it in the shade till he might see what would become of the city. Now, this was Jonah's response to God's question. He didn't answer. If he did, we don't have it recorded. He simply got up and he just stomped off. Am I justified in being right? Is it right for me to be angry? I'll show you. I'm just going to go out here and sit down and pout outside the city, good distance away, so I can see what's going on. Now, possibly, Jonah thought that the Ninevites would quickly revert back to their old ways and that God would have no other recourse than to destroy them. You know, I know what they are, boy. I know they're going to do it, so I'm just going to sit here and wait. And boy, they're going to do exactly what they've always done, and then he's going to have to smash them. Maybe that was it, or perhaps Jonah thought when God saw how determined he was to have God do things his way, maybe God would change his mind and destroy the city for his sake. Maybe that would happen. We're not told why he did what he did, but those are the only two conclusions that I think can be reached for his response. Verse 6, and the Lord God prepared a plant, or provided a vine, the New International has, and made it come up over Jonah that it might be shade for his head, to deliver him from his misery, or discomfort, as the Tanakh has. So Jonah was very grateful for the plant. It's believed that this was a ricinus plant, which is native to that area of Mesopotamia all the way to India, Pakistan, back and the other way toward Turkey. It has large leaves. It grows very quickly, reaches a height of about 9 feet, I think, on average. God provided this plant as an act of compassion for Jonah's physical well-being. And we find here that Jonah appreciated the compassion that he was shown. He very much was thankful for this plant. Verse 7, but as morning dawned the next day, God prepared or provided or appointed, that same word we saw earlier about the fish, a worm. And it so damaged the plant that it withered, like squash plants. You can have them, they're big and beautiful one day, and you go out the next day, and these stinking borers get in there, and overnight the leaves all fall down on them. This is kind of the same situation here. It so damaged the plant that it withered. So the next stage of God's act of mercy, and this is still mercy on God's part, was done for Jonah's spiritual well-being. Bringing the plant was for his physical well-being, to help his mind get in the right direction. And now he takes care of the plant, removes the plant's benefit for spiritual well-being. And his spiritual well-being required physical discomfort. Again, we understand that sometimes is what we need. We need some physical discomfort in order to learn some spiritual lessons. Verse 8, New International. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die, and he said, "If it would be better for me to die than to live." From the details given, the time of this story took place in the hot season in Mesopotamia. That's the time frame, when the average daily temperature is around 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the average. Some days a lot hotter than that, some days cooler, but average is 110 degrees. An east wind can raise that temperature up to 20 degrees above the average. So Jonah was, in effect, experiencing almost a blast furnace. So he was very uncomfortable. Verse 9, New International goes on, but God said to Jonah, "Do you have a right, or is it right for you to be angry about the vine, about the plant?" Or the New Living Translation says, because the plant died. Do you have a right to be angry because the plant died? "I do," Jonah said. "I am angry enough to die." Jonah had feelings of sorrow over the loss of the plant because of the benefit that he had received from this plant while it still lived. He had compassion for the plant. Verse 10, but the Lord said, you have had pity on the plant for which you have not labored, nor made it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night. God has mercifully led Jonah to the point of admitting that he felt the plant should have been spared. Now, Jonah was prepared for God to show him how his desire to have the plant live compared to God's desire to allow the people of Nineveh to live. Verse 11, and should I not pity, or the New American Standard, should I not have compassion on Nineveh? You had compassion on a plant. Should I not have compassion on Nineveh, that great city in which are more than 120,000 persons? Moffat translates that as infants, because an infant, those who are not able to discern their right hand from their left, are very young children. Anywhere from birth to 5 to 7 years old is about what the estimate is. All right? It's from that number of children that the estimate of the population of Nineveh at that time has been determined to be at least 600,000. All right? So, in which are more than 120,000 persons or infants who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, and also much livestock. Unlike Jonah, who did nothing to bring about the existence of the plant, to which he felt pity when it died, preferring that the plant could have remained living, unlike Jonah, God had overseen the creation of Assyria. God was responsible for the existence of Assyria. He had nurtured the Assyrian people, and God had great plans for Assyria in the future. In fact, in Isaiah 19:24, God says that in the millennial reign of Christ, that Israel will be 1/3 Egypt, 1/3 Assyria, 1/3. They're going to be equals in many respects. God has great plans for the Assyrians. Now, in addition, God says here that there was a multitude of innocent children and animals that did not deserve to be destroyed. They had done nothing to warrant the destruction that had been pronounced. The repercussion of the message delivered by Jonah was a period of over 30 years during which the Assyrian Empire ceased aggressive actions against other nations. They no longer were sending armies out to conquer new territories. Not during that time. Not until after the beginning of the rule of Tiglath-Pileser III in 745 BC did the Assyrians again use their armies for invading and plundering other empires. But again, they had to begin becoming aggressive again because God was going to use the aggressive Assyrians to go down and conquer the northern kingdom, which they did about 20 years or so after Tiglath-Pileser III came to the throne. And so they built up their armies and they began aggressive movements. We need to understand something about the prophet Jonah, brethren. The prophets of God were men of great compassion and emotion. Jonah certainly exhibits that. Everything from, God, I knew that I know that I'll be delivered. Well, he was still in the fish, faith. He had great emotion. We can tell that from his prayer. We can tell that from what he did. But he also pouted. He pouted. He whined about things not going his way. So the prophets were not perfect. They were not perfect any more than any of us today are perfect. As in the case of Jonah, we see that God exhibited great patience with his prophets, just as he now, thankfully, shows patience with all of us. So I hope we can take the lessons from the book of Jonah, apply them not only for what the story is about and how it has great significance as far as the sign of the Messiah, but also how this story impacts our lives and our relationship with a very merciful God.